Jordan Peterson, everybody.
Jordan Peterson.
Jordan Peterson.
Jordan Peterson.
Welcome back, Mr. Peterson.
The Canadian psychology professor is somebody people love or love to hate.
Despite what you think about him, there is no denying the professor's impact.
He's undeniably one of the greatest intellectual phenomenons on the planet right now.
In 2025, one of the most recognized voices in the world went completely silent. Jordan Peterson, aged 63, had spent years telling millions how to face suffering, find meaning, and stand firm. Then suddenly, he was gone. No videos or lectures, just silence. It was heartbreaking, a tragedy nobody saw coming. The man who built a career teaching strength was now fighting for his health in an intensive care unit, unable to speak, unable to move. What happens when the teacher of strength loses everything? And what series of events brought him here? Join us as we uncover the full, devastating story of Jordan Peterson. The making of a mind. Jordan Peterson was born in 1962 in a small, cold town called Fairview in northern Alberta, Canada. It was not a famous place. It was quiet, far from everything, and not the kind of town most people ever heard of. But it was exactly the kind of place that shapes a certain type of person. Someone who thinks hard, reads a lot, and takes life seriously. His father was a teacher and his mother worked in a library. They created a home where books and learning mattered. Peterson grew up surrounded by ideas, and from a very young age he wanted to understand things that most children never thought about. While other kids played outside, he was reading. While others watched television, he was thinking. He soon discovered writers who changed him completely. George Orwell showed him how lies destroy societies. Aldous Huxley showed him how comfort could become its own kind of trap. But Alexander Solzhenitsyn hit him the hardest. Solzhenitsyn had survived one of the most brutal prison systems in history and had written about human evil in a way that felt raw and completely honest. Peterson read those words and could not let them go. Something switched on inside him, a deep need to understand why people cause so much suffering and why they so often choose destruction over meaning. That question never left him. It drove everything he did after that. It shaped his education, his career, and eventually made him one of the most talked-about thinkers on the planet. But back then, in Fairview, he was just a quiet boy with a burning need to understand the world. Peterson carried that need with him as he grew older, and it only grew stronger. The small town had given him something no university could teach: the ability to look at the darkest parts of life without turning away. But turning that obsession into a real career would take a long and winding road, one full of unexpected turns, political experiments, and a search for answers that would take him far from the town where it all began. The search for meaning. In his early 20s, Peterson got involved with the New Democratic Party in Canada, a left-leaning political group that cared about ordinary people and social justice. He believed, like many young people do, that politics was where real change happened. But the longer he stayed, the more uncomfortable he became. He watched how people inside political groups behaved. He saw how they used ideology like a weapon. He saw how they punished anyone who disagreed and rewarded those who simply followed along. It bothered him deeply, and eventually, he walked away. That decision changed his life. Leaving politics pushed him towards something deeper, towards psychology, toward the study of why people think and behave the way they do. If politics could not explain the chaos in the world, maybe the human mind could. Peterson committed himself fully to his education. He studied at the University of Alberta, then moved to McGill University in Montreal, where he completed his PhD in clinical psychology. His research focused on heavy subjects: addiction, aggression, and the belief systems people use to make sense of their lives. He was not interested in easy answers. He wanted to get to the root of things, to understand the deep patterns that either hold people together or pull them apart. One question drove everything. Why do human beings create chaos? Why do they choose ideology over truth and destruction over meaning? These were not comfortable questions, but Peterson had never been interested in comfort. He was interested in truth. By the time he finished his doctorate, he had built a powerful way of thinking, one that pulled from psychology, mythology, religion, and philosophy all at once. It was unlike anything being taught in mainstream universities at the time. He was ready to teach. And the first place that gave him a stage was one of the most respected universities in the entire world. The quiet academic years. In 1993, Jordan Peterson became a professor at Harvard University. For 5 years, he taught some of the brightest students in the world. His lectures on personality, mythology, and belief drew crowds of students who wanted the kind of deep, honest thinking that Peterson had been developing his whole life. Harvard was exactly the kind of place where his ideas could breathe. But despite everything Harvard offered, Peterson chose to go back to Canada. In 1998, he joined the University of Toronto, where he would spend the next 2 decades teaching and working as a clinical psychologist at the same time. During the day, he taught in lecture halls. In private practice, he sat with real patients dealing with real pain. That combination kept him sharp. The patients reminded him that ideas had real consequences. The teaching gave him space to keep asking the big questions. During these years, nobody outside of universities knew who he was. He was simply a hard-working professor doing his job, filling classrooms with students who found his ideas genuinely life-changing, but whose name meant nothing to the wider world. In 1999, he published his first major book, Maps of Meaning. It took him over 15 years to write. It was a big, difficult book that tried to explain how people use story, myth, and religion to survive in a world full of uncertainty and chaos. It was not a bestseller. It was not easy to read. But for the people who did read it, it felt like something genuinely rare. An honest attempt to answer questions that most academics were too afraid to even ask. Peterson spent those quiet years building something slowly and carefully, lecture by lecture, patient by patient, idea by idea. He was laying the groundwork for something the world had not yet noticed. He had no idea that everything was about to change and that one simple decision, made in one unexpected moment, would pull him out of the quiet and throw him into the center of a global storm. The spark that ignited everything. In 2016, Jordan Peterson did something that changed his life forever. He uploaded a series of videos to YouTube. They were not polished. They were not professionally produced. They were just a man sitting in front of a camera, speaking his mind. But what he said in those videos set off a reaction that nobody could have predicted. Peterson spoke out against a Canadian law known as Bill C-16. The law proposed adding gender identity and gender expression to the list of protected categories under the Canadian Human Rights Act. Peterson's concern was specific. He believed the law could be used to force people to use certain pronouns, and he refused to accept that any government had the right to compel what words came out of a person's mouth. He was not arguing against kindness. He was arguing against compulsion. The reaction was immediate and ferocious. The university sent him warning letters. Student groups protested outside his office. Media outlets attacked him. Activists called him dangerous, hateful, and bigoted. The pressure was enormous, and most people in his position would have backed down quietly and moved on. Peterson did not back down. He kept talking, and the world kept listening. Within weeks, his videos had been watched by hundreds of thousands of people. Within months, the number climbed into the millions. People who had never heard of clinical psychology or Carl Jung or the psychology of belief were suddenly watching a university professor talk for hours about meaning, responsibility, and truth. Something in his message connected with a huge number of people who felt that nobody else was saying what needed to be said. He became a symbol almost overnight. To some, he was a brave defender of free speech and individual rights. To others, he was a dangerous figure giving permission to people who wanted to push back against progress. The debate around him grew louder and more polarized with every passing week. Peterson himself seemed both energized and overwhelmed by what was happening. He had spent decades in quiet academic work, and suddenly he was at the center of a global cultural argument that showed no signs of slowing down. What nobody could see at the time was the cost. The stress of constant public attack, the relentless misrepresentation, and the pressure of being turned into a symbol rather than a person were already beginning to take a toll on him. Quietly and invisibly, he had found his voice. He had found his audience. But the storm that followed would test him in ways that no lecture, no book, and no philosophy could have fully prepared him for. The rise to global influence. By 2018, Jordan Peterson was no longer just a controversial professor. He was a global phenomenon. His book, 12 Rules for Life, was released in January of that year and became one of the fastest-selling nonfiction books in recent memory. It was translated into dozens of languages and sold millions of copies across the world. People bought it for themselves, gave it to their children, and left reviews describing it as the book that had saved their lives. The book itself was not complicated in its core message. It told people to take responsibility for themselves, to tell the truth, to stand up straight, and to find meaning in the middle of suffering rather than running from it. These were old ideas in many ways, drawn from psychology, religion, philosophy, and mythology. But Peterson had a way of making them feel urgent and alive, as if they were being said for the very first time. He went on a world tour that filled enormous theaters in city after city. He sat across from some of the most well-known journalists and thinkers of the time and held his ground in long, difficult conversations that millions of people watched online. He appeared on podcasts, television programs, and stages across multiple continents. Everywhere he went, crowds came to listen. But the fame brought something darker with it. The more visible he became, the more he was attacked. Critics accused him of being a far-right figure, of providing cover for dangerous political movements, and of using complicated language to disguise simple, harmful ideas. Many of these accusations he rejected completely, and many of those who made them had clearly never engaged honestly with his actual work. The misrepresentation was constant and exhausting. Through it all, Peterson kept going. He kept writing, kept speaking, kept engaging. But people close to him could see that the pressure was building in ways that were not always visible to the outside world. The travel was relentless. The attacks were personal. The expectations placed on him by both supporters and critics were becoming impossible to manage. Beneath all of it, something else was happening that almost nobody knew about. His body was beginning to break down. The physical strain of the schedule, combined with private family stress that he had not yet shared with the world, was quietly dismantling the foundation that had kept him standing. The world saw a man at the peak of his powers. What was actually happening behind the scenes was something far more fragile and far more human than anyone watching from the outside could see. The invisible cracks. While the world watched Jordan Peterson speak to sold-out crowds and dominate headlines, something was quietly falling apart behind the scenes. The cracks were invisible to almost everyone, but they were there, and they had been forming for longer than most people realized. It started with his health. For years, Peterson had struggled with a range of physical symptoms that were difficult to diagnose and difficult to manage. He eventually made a dramatic change to his diet, eliminating almost everything and eating only beef, salt, and water. It sounded extreme because it was extreme, but he and his daughter Michaela, who had her own serious health struggles, found that this approach reduced many of the symptoms that had been making daily life harder than it should have been. It was not a choice made for trends or attention. It was a choice made out of desperation. Then came the news that broke something deeper inside him. His wife Tammy, the woman he had been with since they were children, was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of kidney cancer. The prognosis was not good. Peterson, who had spent his entire career helping other people face suffering, was now sitting across from the very thing he feared most, the possible loss of the person who mattered more to him than anyone else in the world. He kept working. He kept speaking. He kept appearing in public as if everything was manageable. But the weight of what he was carrying privately was enormous, and it showed in ways that were easy to miss if you were not looking closely. In 2016, around the same time his public profile began to explode, Peterson had been prescribed benzodiazepines. These are powerful medications used to treat anxiety. At the time, they seemed like a reasonable response to the mounting stress in his life. He was under attack from multiple directions. His wife was seriously ill, and his body was struggling. The medication helped, at least at first. But benzodiazepines are not designed for long-term use. They are highly addictive, and dependence can develop faster than patients and even some doctors realize. Peterson took them as prescribed, but over time the dose crept upward, and the body began to need more just to feel normal. Nobody watching his lectures or reading his books had any idea. He looked strong. He sounded strong, but underneath the surface, the foundation was cracking. Slowly, quietly, and with consequences that would eventually become impossible to hide from the world. The collapse. By 2019, the cracks that had been forming quietly beneath the surface finally gave way completely. Jordan Peterson, one of the most recognized voices in the world, was falling apart in private, while the public waited for his next lecture, his next book, his next appearance. What happened next was one of the most dramatic and heartbreaking collapses in recent public life. It reached a point where his body could no longer function without the medication. When his daughter Michaela and his family attempted to reduce his dosage, the withdrawal hit him with devastating force. Benzodiazepine withdrawal is considered one of the most dangerous and painful of all addiction withdrawals. It can cause seizures, severe anxiety, hallucinations, and in serious cases, it can be life-threatening. For Peterson, it was all of those things at once. His mind, which had spent decades processing some of the most complex ideas in psychology and philosophy, began to break down. He could not think clearly. He could not sleep. He could not function in any of the ways that had defined his entire adult life. The man who had stood on stages in front of thousands of people and spoken for hours without notes was now struggling to get through a single day. His family made the decision to take him to Russia, where a clinic offered a treatment involving medically induced coma. The idea was to use the coma to help his body reset and survive the withdrawal process without the full force of the neurological storm that was tearing through him. It was a desperate measure taken by a family that had run out of other options. The treatment in Russia did not go smoothly. Peterson developed pneumonia during the procedure, which created a new and serious threat on top of everything his body was already dealing with. There were complications that affected his motor function, the basic physical ability to move and control his own body, and the recovery that followed was slow, painful, and deeply uncertain. For a long period after the treatment, those closest to him were not sure how much of him would come back. The world noticed his absence. Weeks turned into months, and Peterson simply disappeared from public life. No videos, no statements, and no public appearances. The silence from a man who had never stopped talking felt enormous and deeply unsettling to the millions of people who had built parts of their lives around his ideas. When his family eventually gave updates, the picture they painted was sobering. Peterson had survived, but he was not the same. The neurological damage left by the withdrawal, the pneumonia, and the induced coma had taken something from him that could not simply be recovered through willpower or discipline or any of the tools he had spent his life teaching others to use. The man who had told the world to pick up its burden and keep walking had been brought completely to his knees, and the road back would be longer and harder than anyone could have imagined. The fragile return. When Jordan Peterson reappeared in 2020, the world looked at him and saw immediately that something had changed. He moved more carefully. He spoke more slowly. The sharpness that had once made him almost electric on camera was still there in moments, but it was quieter now, sitting beneath a visible fragility that he made no attempt to hide. He had nearly died, and it showed, not as weakness exactly, but as the unmistakable mark of a man who had been somewhere very dark and had only partially found his way back. He spoke openly about what he had been through. He did not dress it up or make it sound more manageable than it was. He talked about the withdrawal, the coma, the months of silence, and the slow and painful process of trying to rebuild basic functions that most people never think about. For someone whose entire identity had been built around the idea of facing suffering honestly, this public honesty felt consistent, even if the suffering itself had been far greater than anything he had previously faced. At the same time, his personal life was carrying its own quiet weight. Tammy, his wife, was still fighting her cancer. The diagnosis that had shaken him years earlier had not gone away, and the illness had continued to progress in difficult and unpredictable ways. Peterson had returned from the edge of his own collapse, only to find that the person he loved most was still in the middle of her own battle. Then, something unexpected happened. Tammy's condition began to improve. The cancer, which had seemed so threatening for so long, responded to treatment in ways that surprised her doctors. It was not a clean or simple recovery, but it was real. And for a family that had been living under enormous darkness for years, it felt like something close to a miracle. Peterson continued to rebuild. He published Beyond Order, a follow-up to 12 Rules for Life in 2021. Writing it had been part of his recovery, a way of processing everything he had experienced and finding language for the kind of suffering that goes beyond what any rulebook can prepare you for. The book was received warmly by the millions of readers who had been waiting to hear from him again. He made another significant decision during this period. After more than 2 decades, he left the University of Toronto. He also stepped away from traditional media and built his own platform, launching Peterson Academy, an online education project designed to bring serious intellectual content directly to anyone who wanted it. From the outside, it looked like recovery, and in many ways it was, but those who watched closely could see that the foundation was still fragile, that the man who had returned was working hard every single day just to maintain what most people take completely for granted, and that the story was not yet finished. The final blow. Just when it seemed like Jordan Peterson had survived the worst of it, life hit him again. And this time it came from a direction that nobody could have anticipated. Not a public controversy, not a philosophical attack, not even a return of the dependency that had nearly killed him before. It came from something as ordinary and invisible as the air inside a family home. In 2025, Peterson was helping clean out a property belonging to his family when he was exposed to toxic mold. Mold exposure of this kind can affect almost anyone to some degree, but for a person whose immune system had already been severely weakened by years of physical and neurological trauma, the exposure was catastrophic. His body, which had very little left in reserve, could not fight back the way a healthy immune system would. He developed a condition called chronic inflammatory response syndrome, known as CIRS. It is a condition triggered by biotoxins, often from mold, that causes the immune system to attack the body itself in a sustained and damaging way. For Peterson, the response was severe and rapid. His health deteriorated quickly, and what began as an immune reaction soon escalated into something far more dangerous. Pneumonia set in, then sepsis, a life-threatening infection of the blood that can shut down organs and kill within hours if not treated aggressively. Peterson was rushed to intensive care, where he would remain for nearly a month. He was unable to speak. He was unable to communicate meaningfully with the people around him. The man whose voice had reached tens of millions of people across the world was lying in a hospital bed, silent and unreachable. The neurological damage that followed added another layer to an already devastating situation. Peterson developed polyneuropathy, a condition that affects the nerves throughout the body, causing pain, weakness, and a loss of normal function in the limbs. It was a direct consequence of the sepsis and the systemic attack his body had been under. And it meant that even after the immediate crisis passed, his recovery would be complicated by nerve damage that could take months or years to improve and might never fully resolve. In total, Peterson spent 5 months in hospital. 5 months away from his family, his work, his audience, and the life he had spent decades building. His daughter, Michaela, kept the world informed through updates that were honest and difficult to read. The man who had once filled arenas was now focused entirely on the most basic goal imaginable, simply staying alive. He was 63 years old, already carrying the damage from his earlier collapse, and now facing a second devastating assault on a body that had never fully healed from the first. The world watched and waited, and this time the silence felt even heavier than it had before. But Peterson was not done yet. He would come back, although not fully. The aftermath. A different kind of strength. When Jordan Peterson finally left the hospital and returned home to Arizona, he was not the man who had once filled arenas, and dominated global conversations. He was slower. He was quieter. The neurological damage from the polyneuropathy meant that simple physical tasks required effort and concentration that most people never have to think about. The recovery was not a straight line moving upward. It was uncertain, uneven, and deeply humbling for a man who had built his entire life around the idea of pushing forward no matter what. The daily reality of his life had been reduced to something very small and very focused. There were no world tours. There were no packed lecture halls. There were no long, intense interviews that went on for hours. There was just the slow and careful work of trying to heal, one day at a time, in a way that could not be rushed or forced or willed into happening faster than his body would allow. His family became the center of everything. Tammy, who had fought her own long battle with cancer, was now by his side as he fought his. The roles had shifted in ways that neither of them could have planned for, and there was something deeply human about that. Two people who had been together since childhood, taking turns holding each other up through suffering that would have broken most people apart. His daughter Michaela, who had been his voice to the world during his darkest periods, remained close. His grandchildren brought a kind of warmth and simplicity to his days that no philosophical framework could manufacture or replace. From the sidelines, Peterson watched his own work continue to reach people. Videos he had recorded years earlier were still being watched by millions. Ideas he had developed over decades were still sparking conversations across the world. There was something both comforting and quietly painful about that, knowing that the work was still alive and moving while the man behind it sat still, waiting for his body to catch up with everything his mind still wanted to do. And in that stillness, something important became clear. The philosophy that Peterson had spent his life building was not wrong. The ideas about responsibility, meaning, truth, and the importance of facing suffering rather than running from it, those ideas held up. But they were incomplete in one important way that only lived experience could reveal. Knowing how to carry a burden does not make the burden lighter. Having a map does not mean the road will be easy. Meaning is real, and it matters deeply, but it does not make a person immune to collapse, illness, loss, or the simple, brutal randomness of life. That was the lesson that no chapter in any of his books had fully captured. Not because he had been dishonest, but because some things can only be learned by living through them, by lying in a hospital bed at 63 years old, unable to speak, and finding out what remains when everything else has been stripped away. What remained was simple: family, breath, and the next small step. And the quiet, hard-won understanding that sometimes the most courageous thing a person can do is not stand on a stage and inspire millions, but simply keep going through a morning that offers no applause and no audience, only the slow and uncertain work of healing and the fragile, stubborn refusal to stop. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.